In part 2 of our special series on voting in the USA, the big question is, who the heck set things up this way? From reading tests to ID challenges, felon disenfranchisement laws, and the endless purging of voter rolls, the U.S. is almost alone among industrial world democracies in having no uniform federal voting law. Why? And how is history playing out today? As early voting begins in states across the country, we're joined by Wendy Weiser, who directs the Brennan Center's work on voting rights and elections, Docia Buffington, who is the lead organizer for the Youth Voter Collective. Also with us, renowned author and professor Frances Fox Piven. She's written many books, including Why Americans Still Don't Vote. And also joining us, Dr. Divine Pryor. He is Executive Director of the Center for NuLeadership on Urban Solutions. Thanks for coming in, Dr. Divine. I want to say that this week's special programming on voting is made possible in part by our sponsors at the Progressive Book Club, the Media Consortium, Progress Ohio, and the League of Independent Voters. All right, you kick off, Frances. Why Americans still don't vote. You know, around about this time, you begin to hear about apathy in America and the turnout is not what it should be. I'm always kind of struck by how many people do vote, given the challenges that face them. But answer your question, why Americans still don't vote, and do they still don't vote?
It's, as you said, the United States has the lowest level of participation in voting of any democratic country, and has had that for more than a century. If you try to understand why, your attention inevitably is drawn to a kind of obstructive apparatus of voter registration and polling and requirements, photo ID requirements, this kind of requirement, that kind of requirements, in the old days, literacy requirements, poll tax requirements. But why do we have that kind of apparatus? And then your attention is drawn, I think inevitably, to the way in our two-party system, the way parties compete. You know, I teach political science, and in Political Science 101, not me, but most professors begin with a kind of axiom that political parties make democracy work, and they make democracy work because they mobilize voters. They bring them to the polls by naming their issues, putting up good-looking candidates, stuff like that. Sometimes they do that. Even more often, they compete by figuring out how to limit voting by groups that are likely to vote for the opposition party. That's much more efficient. That means if it's usually troublesome groups, groups who are likely to raise raucous issues, difficult issues, and it keeps the electorate smaller, much more efficient for party operations, and it keeps the troublesome voters out of the system.
So it's not so much about voter turnout, it's voter stay in.
That's right.
How is this resonating with you, Wendy, at the Brennan Center?
Yeah, well, this is actually something that's been happening not only by political parties, but we've been seeing across the country, different state election officials and legislatures adding more and more obstacles to voting that actually specifically affect certain groups more than others and make it much harder for them to vote and to turn out. And, you know, this, can be done for benign reasons. It can also be done for political reasons to try and suppress votes of disfavored voters.
Now, one of the things we hear from, or we heard a lot from the Republican administration in the last, or the Justice Department in the last 4 years, was that there needed to be much more strict scrutiny to the threat of fraud. How much fraud actually happens, Wendy?
Well, we've done extensive studies on this, and as it turns out, there's very, very little individual voter fraud at the polls, which is the kind of fraud that is supposedly being targeted by these new restrictions, and especially things like the voter ID laws. The Department of Justice actually engaged in a 5-year top priority investigation and found not one case of proven individual voter fraud, because we have a lot of protections in place. This is criminal to do this. But they're drumming up fears of this kind of voter fraud and using that to justify more and more restrictions to voters.
Because historically that's been at least the cover story, hasn't it, Francis? I mean, why we need to have all these restrictions is because somebody might try and vote twice or vote for a dead person?
It's one of the great myths of American electoral politics is that we have a big problem with voter fraud. Voter fraud is much more likely among some kinds of people than among other kinds of people. At the beginning of the 20th century, reformers in the North singled out immigrant voters who had dirty blood. You know, they were from Italy or something like that. And now when, it's mostly Republicans right now, but doesn't mean that Democrats haven't done it in the past, when Republicans invoke this myth of voter fraud, they also invoke an idea that it is African Americans and Latinos who are likely to commit voter fraud. Now, in fact, as Wendy said, and as Lorraine Minetti, who has done extensive studies, very, very sober, correct studies of voter fraud, verifies, there isn't any voter fraud. Well, why should there be, logically, why should there be voter fraud? We have so much trouble getting people to come to the polls once. Why should they come again and again and again with different names and different identities? Ordinary people don't want to fraud the system. There is election fraud, a lot of election fraud in the American decentralized, sprawling, pasted together system. But that fraud is by party operatives.
All right, we'll get to that in just a second. We've talked in the abstract about these obstacles that exist, that you have to kind of prove yourself, prove that you're of the age you are, in the address you are, with the qualifications that you have. And you mentioned during the era of Jim Crow, those qualifications were, you know, to do with literacy and could you recite the Constitution, any kind of qualification somebody felt like making up. How is it playing out today? Docia, you're working with young voters. These are people who have to do that proving for the first time. What do they have to prove?
I guess a lot of the issues specifically around youth voting, student voting in particular, is this idea of where do you really live? And there's a number of problems with this. With young people in general, it's a matter of moving all the time, not having ID cards that reflect this, but sometimes being asked for them at the polls. And for student voters in particular, it's this idea of do you vote where you go to school or do you vote at home?
Now, that was a big issue that came up during even the Iowa primaries.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely, and I think you see a lot of different issues going into that. One, students not knowing where they're supposed to be registered, and also people specifically trying to make sure that students don't vote in a city, whether it's because of some kind of party affiliation. Oh, these students are going to vote for this candidate, and we don't want that because it goes against maybe the politics of the rest of that city. Or it goes to the idea of you don't really live here. This isn't really your community. You're not going to be a permanent resident here. So we don't want you to be a part of our politics. And so you see a lot of targeting of students for that kind of thing in particular.